The potion sat on the large table that almost filled the small office at the back of the potions classroom. In fact, the potion is inaccurate as it suggests that only one vial of the potentially world-changing magical concoction is there, sitting in a sea of ebony blackness alone and isolated. In fact, the potion was on the dark wooden table but in so many different states and forms that it would have taken a very long time to count them. Severus Snape, who was sitting on a chair in front of them, would just have to admit that he had come to a dead end. It was what he had said to Dumbledore. It was the science he was mostly concerned about. He had come up with many ways to refine it, of course. The basic potion and its magical effects were, as he had said 5 days ago to the headmaster, entirely verified, but it was the science behind it which needed to be resolved, and without the results of the analyses that Tunks had promised him, or without someone with several years of experience in the Muggle world and who had spent many months in the Wizard One, it was not about to get any better. Looking at the cluttered table again, he wondered whether fleeing her parents' house again would be a good idea, if it would cause her mother to threaten to curse him once more. It wasn't so much the speed of the results but rather, whether allowing the witch to pass the hair that had arrived with the first letter from Cecilia Frobisher on to her husband meant that the analysis would be entirely accurate. It would be some good the Muggle analyzing the samples, but would he be as judicious and objective as his ex-research partner? There was nothing for it but to wait. Wait until the order meeting that evening to find out the results. He would then attempt to request for other samples to be analyzed, those of Remus Lupin in both his normal and lupine state and Tabitha Penwright. They at least should procure some meaningful results. He looked back at the table and nodded slowly as he shelved the potion in his mind before opening the long thin drawer that lay below the tabletop, removing the letter that had arrived for him almost a week ago and recalling a time not too long ago when he had sent a letter to her. Petunia Dursley. He had felt sure that once she had read the contents of it she would never at all reply. But, of course, never ended 6 days ago when he had received a lengthy missive detailing her flaws. Well, that had been what he had called them when he had written to Petunia Evans to tell her it was over. It must have taken immense courage for her to have done this. Clearly Cecilia Frobisher was responsible. There was nothing that it contained he didn't already know or didn't suspect, and Snape pondered on the irony that, having spent a large portion of his time over several months in the intimate company of a Muggle, he would have gladly have accepted Petunia no matter what her flaws. Would only things have been different? Gripping the letter in his left hand so that it crumpled into an uneven ball, Snape pulled open the drawer again and threw it back in, annoyed. And what was annoying him? Well, his aforementioned ex-research partner, who was currently in hiding in the home of Petunia F. Dursley. That was, A. What was annoying him in particular was, B. her absence, for he knew that had she still been at Hogwarts the scientific side of this problem would have been solved and concluded long before the potion was, and, C. he was getting stuck, and the only way things could be better would be Cecilia Jane Frobisher being there to help him. Because if she magic she could make better potions than some wizards. Snape got suddenly to his feet and, closing the door on the unfinished mess on his desk, he strode through the potions classroom, into the teaching corridor and then left, towards the courtyard. From there he entered the door opposite the Great Hall and climbed the stairs which would eventually lead him to the teachers' quarters. Retrieving what he was looking for, the wizard made his way back down to the classroom and back into his office. He turned a few pages of one of her notebooks, the ones he had removed when he had taken her from the cottage at a Privet Drive during his function as the secret keeper. He had read over them more than a dozen times, taking in the information and processing it, refining the work and improving it. But what he had come to realize was, whereas he was indeed brilliant at both science and magic, Cecilia was brilliant too, and, furthermore, she embodied both disciplines. The books were testament to that. Every so often little doodles appeared, revealing her thoughts, and Snape recalled her sitting in the Muggle Studies classroom, as she was wont to do, idling away as if waiting for something, or simply contemplating as she was waiting for a test piece of the research batches to blend to completion. Snape looked back to his last effort, the second cauldron full of the evening, and he watched the inky black substance swirl and move within its container. There was no reference to any form of energy that had caused it to change and transform into what it was now, yet energy must have played a part. He leaned over, touching the metal of the cauldron, and was surprised at its coldness. Clearly this potion, this chemical reaction, was endothermic, and in being so must have consequences to its efficacy. Not its efficacy with Harry. This wasn't the original potion he was brewing now, indeed not even the refined one. He had used the information at the back of the books to construct something ultimately new. But still, she wasn't the now for him to speak to, for him to verify his conclusion by asking her suspicions of the potion itself, that potions with the ultimate efficacy were produced which amplified the energy and frequency required despite debilitating the drinker in some way, so much so the effects could be permanent. He needn't have considered it. Had anyone asked, he could have claimed he had enough to do with Harry's potion that anything additional would not be profitable. It was a conclusion he would have drawn almost a year ago. What if he didn't develop it, after all the information she had given him? Would Severus Snape pursuing the aspect of science for Harry Potter's potion mean she would love him less or him more? And if he managed to make it work, she would always be a little in his debt. She did give him the notes for a reason. Long forgotten feelings roused in Snape's mind as he pictured her sleeping. This is how he would always remember her. How, lost in dreams, he watched her be. Not doing anything but just being her. How he had expressed his feelings for her. How she had responded. And he would show her his love now, not through physical desire but by assisting one who needed it. He had the skill and the knowledge through the notes on lycanthropy provided by her to develop a cure for Lupin. After that, his life would change for Severus. No knock had accompanied the sound of Albus Dumbledore's voice as it penetrated Snape's consciousness. He looked at the door and then back to his hand, where he realized that Dumbledore was staring, and also that he had within it the first letter, now wrinkled and creased. "I see you received the letter that was delivered inadvertently to me," said the wizard, closing the office door behind him. Snape nodded. "Indeed. Mrs. Frobisher. It contains everything we need to know, to complete the potion." Flattening it a little, he held it open in Dumbledore's direction. The headmaster's eyes rested on the small, amicably drawn illustration in the corner, his eyes sparkling a little. "She has done all we have asked of her," continued Snape. "Might I suggest you know, Severus, that it could have been any of the letters sent to Mrs. Frobisher that alerted the Ministry to her presence," interrupted Dumbledore as he folded the letter back towards a silent Snape. "Indeed. It was fortunate that you were able to create a secure enough place for Mrs. Frobisher to hide. I delayed them as long as I could. It is for that which we all will be eternally grateful. So now there is no reason that she cannot return to complete her work," prompted Snape, turning to look at the cauldron before him, mystified slightly as to why it had begun to separate out in places. "And I am sure that would be perfectly possible if Mrs. Frobisher not pursuing the second task, the one that you unwittingly led her to through Miss Evans's notes." "Mrs. Potter's notes," corrected Snape. "As I recall, she was still Miss Evans that night when she came to you." He broke off, paying keen attention to the cauldron that Snape had just abandoned, replacing him as the prime observer of the substance. The potions teacher felt a silent rage begin to build, and then Dumbledore looked at him. He hung his head limply. And recalling the night that he had followed them from the castle, watched Lupin transform into a werewolf. How James Potter had saved him from being pawed to death. How he had stumbled into the castle with superficial wounds, determined to report the incident. How instead he had come upon Lily Evans, his old childhood friend. How he had dismissed her because of her growing closeness to that band of aforementioned troublemakers. how she had calmed him down and talked to him for a long time before revealing her own thoughts about Lupin's condition, how she'd explained that she'd been collecting information about it so she could one day find a cure. How she was sure, even after her copious notes, theories and predictions, she knew she was not clever enough to draw it all together, not least make a potion to combat the effects. Your fervent desire to keep your promise to Miss Evans has yielded more than just Lupin's cure, concluded Dumbledore quietly, as if he had been an interloper in Snape's silent memories. I did not develop the Wolfsbane potion, Headmaster, replied Snape, nor have I progressed with anything more than a greater yield from the raw ingredients. Dumbledore sighed and smoothed the shorter pieces of his beard into a point. By giving Cecilia Frobisher Lily Evans's field notes you have given her not just hope but a purpose. You know more than anything that in her situation she would have yielded to impatience and restlessness before now? A mind like that seldom rests. Snape said nothing. There was a choice now that still had to be made, but he wasn't going to make it. If I have one regret, it is that by giving her the tools to complete what I could not has led her to a life of misery and sorrow. Were she to complete the potion, and all that Lupin hopes for in a recovery from his lycanthropy, and she were to marry him, then it would be a false union. You believe Remus Lupin's loving interest to be false? It wasn't a question. Snape closed his eyes and then opened them, looking at the now gelatinous mass again. When he returned his gaze to Dumbledore, the headmaster had his arms folded, matching his own gaze of steely determination. It is not for us to decide, Severus. People must be allowed to make their own choices. Even if it will lead to their unhappiness. It remains to be seen if the feelings he claims would be the same were he not ill. Or if Mrs. Frobisher were not a mole. Or if, he broke off, turning back towards the cauldron of now cold potion and hoping his own great skills at occlumency were enough to keep from Dumbledore the images he had seen race through his mind when he took Mrs. Frobisher from Lupin's cottage to Privet Drive, when he had extrapolated her future based on her present circumstances. When he had imagined her confiding her woes to him, seeking his counsel. It is not for us to decide, Severus. If Mrs. Frobisher succeeds in untangling the information Lily Evans so faithfully committed to parchment, then there is nothing to prevent us, as a friend, from listening to her worries as you have always done. You must not make the mistake of confusing her for Lily. An image flickered over Snape's mind, one of youth and passion. A woman, asleep. A woman that he loved. Nor should Lupin, exclaimed Snape, hotly. I understand Cecilia Frobisher. What she is, a mole and a woman. Powerless. Unenlightened. She is in need of protection, not to be placed in further danger. She is certainly not Lily Evans. A few moments passed. And then Dumbledore spoke again. It was good of Petunia Dursley to reveal to you her experiences, Severus. He glanced at the address portion of the envelope, noting his own obliterated name. Had she the mindset of her sister, then I could probably accepted her to Hogwarts. However, she chose a different path. Snape closed his eyes, fighting for mental clarity. Once it was established, he opened them again. Harry's potion will soon be completed in its entirety, and it will be fit for him to take. Snape gestured to the potion. This, his base. He may take up to 24 hours in advance, which might speed up the efficacy and be less complicated in the heat of battle. It will be attuned to his natural frequency and that of the killing curse, which he must use himself alone. I have only to fine-tune it, which can be done when I have completed the scientific analyses of which I spoke to you earlier this week, and of which some Tunks may well have completed by this evening's meeting. He bowed his head and Dumbledore lay a hand on his shoulder. Excellent work as usual, Severus. Removing his hand, Dumbledore turned and held the handle of the office door. Good night. The headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry left the potions classroom office, leaving the subject's professor staring at a parchment letter recognizable to him as being from the same source as the first. 88,888,888. Archie Busby didn't want to be the dark, cold, wet, windswept place. He looked at the horizon as the dying sun's light irradiated off the interface between land and sea and glanced up further at the huge rain cloud that was poised to shed its contents all over again. When he took the job almost 3 years ago, Archie didn't think that the permanent localized storm that was designed to depress everyone inside the building would cause him to be so down, but, slowly and steadily, that was what was beginning to happen. He'd thought about applying for a transfer. There were other wizard prisons around the world that would appreciate his skills and attention to detail. He shook his head and watched the Ministry witch who had appeared in the lobby of the most fortified wizard building in Britain. Well, he'd just get this over with, he thought as he selected the correct bunch of keys for the corridors that he needed. "Are you ready, Mr. Busby?" The witch's voice was light but firm. "I need at least 2 of them, 3 if you can spare them." "What are you needing 3 Dementors for, Miss Doctor?" "Penwright," said Tabitha Penwright. "Ministerial business." "Oh. That's what they all said." Archie scratched his stubbly chin as he sought the key for the first barred door. Ministerial business. As if they didn't need their full quota of Dementors for the prisoners here and the Ministry show up every so often borrowing them. Through the second door they came and Archie felt himself shudder. The wretched creatures always made him feel like that. He glanced across at the Ministry witch, at her anguished expression. She hadn't come across Dementors this close. And she wanted to take them back to the Ministry for magic? Well, that was what the paperwork had said, and she was a Ministry witch. But her manner and demeanor, like a scared rabbit, made Archie Busby think. "You are capable of handling them," he added as they walked down a dull, dark corridor towards a third barred door. "You're taking them back to the Ministry, right?" Tabitha nodded. "I won't be taking them physically though," she added as the door squealed open. "I'm here to give them instructions about a small task we have for them." Archie shook his head in disapproval. It was bad enough that he had to be in charge of these foul creatures without the Ministry popping in when it felt like it and disrupting the smooth running of the place. "That is okay with you, isn't it?" Archie looked at Tabitha Penwright sharply, unsure whether it was a genuine question or veiled sarcasm. He chose to believe it was the former. "Of course, Miss Penwright. I'll isolate 2 now." 3, corrected Tabitha. "I understand Azkaban is not at its fullest capacity. I need them for only a short time and they will be returned to you." Archie paused, before nodding grudgingly in agreement. He entered the third door, which looked to Tabitha like a black room. Its dimensions she could not guess, but, as it was supposed to house hundreds of Dementors, she guessed it would be rather large. A few moments later and Officer Busby returned, his expression one of distress but with a small smile of triumph on his face. He handed a small metal disc to Tabitha. "Here you are," he said, nodding at her. "I got the buggers. Watch as you go, eh? It'd be better to give them the instructions for whatever you want them to do first before you leave, otherwise you might find them floating off in all directions." He waited for Tabitha to move. When she didn't, he frowned and stood aside from the door. "Miss Penwright? They're yours now." "Officer Busby," said Tabitha, flashing him the most flattering smile that she could manage. "This is my first time handling Dementors. I would be most grateful if you could show me how to give them the instructions for their task. I have it written down here." From the inside of her robe, Tabitha had taken a folded piece of parchment stamped with the Ministry's blue seal, which she handed to Archie. The prison officer took it and unfolded it, reading it in its entirety. "I see," he said gravely, folding up the document and returning it to Tabitha. If you'd have said it was concerning, but Archie's words about who the Dementors were to be used to capture were drowned out from a cacophony of moans, screams and shouts above them. Clearly the Dementors from the room adjacent to them had gone on their rounds in the prison cells. Tabitha closed her eyes as she waited for the shock of the noise to pass her by. "Okay," he said. "I won't be long. What mode of transport are you using?" "Broom," said Tabitha, motioning to Azkaban's front desk, outside which she had left it. "Excellent," said Archie Busby, glancing into Blackened Room as he spoke, his voice tinged with pride. "To catch this felon, well, I am most honored to be part of the service. You can go, Miss Penwright. Once I've given them the instructions you told me about, they'll go automatically to the Ministry for Magic. All you need to do then is to tell them to Acton. Roberts, your mother's brother. 88,888,888. It should have taken Tabitha Penwright no more than an hour to fly directly from the North Sea to London. It was night time. There was little traffic and it was cold. No self-respecting witch would want to be out of doors on this cold summer night when they could be back in the office solving mysteries. Unfortunately, that was not what she would be able to do. When she received the message from Dolores Umbridge to return from Hogwarts to assist the Ministry, Tabitha didn't have to be told twice. But when she arrived there, it seemed she was needed not to continue to work on her mystery, as Fancy had told her would be the case. Rather, it seemed, she would be undertaking a junior role, one of interrogation and mostly of logistics and paperwork. It wasn't that Tabitha couldn't carry out the job. Indeed, the work was easy. All Ministry workers were trained in basic junior roles, so they could double up where necessary. The work tended to be tedious and very annoying, especially when one department had a different agenda to another, and often, as a junior, you had to liaise between more than two. Tabitha gripped her broomstick tightly with both hands as she contemplated what lay before her, and she pictured a weekend of waiting, filling in forms and walking around the Ministry building slowly getting nowhere. Her first task was over, though. She had taken the owl letter she had received that morning with her to Azkaban and organized the Dementors. They would be necessary for another job, one of vital security. Tabitha had breathed a sigh of relief to know that they would arrive automatically at the Ministry in London, for she had had visions of the three of them tailing after her all the way there and not being able to control them properly if things went wrong. A glow lay on the horizon, like the yolk of an egg. London lay ahead, no more than 20 minutes away, and her desk no more than half an hour. Tabitha bit her lip as she thought of what her weekend was about to entail. She was to supervise, with other ministerial workers in junior roles, dangerous half-breeds taken away for their protection. Not that they would be dangerous now, not know they were in the Ministry's cells. Tabitha shuddered. It wouldn't be interesting, nor would it be short. Dolores had told her that they were still collecting them in. Tabitha knew what that meant. She would be there, processing names and descriptions, extracting statements and filing gruesome details of their victims that they had assaulted or killed, recommending their trials for wizard slaughter or murder. Well, thought Tabitha as London loomed nearer. Someone had to do the dog's body work after all, and she had told Dolores that she wanted to be back at the Ministry. Somehow though, she could see her being relieved of the duties of junior in time to return to Hogwarts to teach on Monday. As she flew into the outskirts of the sodium yellow sky, Tabitha's mind drifted to the third piece of mail that Dobby had ceremoniously presented to her that morning. She recalled her astonishment when she had read about an end-of-year ball to which she, in her capacity as Mole Studies teacher, was invited. That had been the best invitation of all. Not only would she see the students in their finery, but she would know that her next journey back to London would be her last, and that never again would she have to set foot in that wretched school. 88,888,888. How lovely to get dressed up in her finery, thought Hermione as she watched the early morning sunlight rise from the top of the Gryffindor common room. The stairs that led to the girls' and boys' bedrooms led further on, and she had often wondered where they led. 2 nights ago she found out by continuing up them for quite a way before coming to a small wooden door. Behind it was a small circular room which rose to a point above her head. This was quite obviously the top of the tower of which the dormitories were a part. 2 nights ago, having tried to engage Ron in conversation and failing miserably and not wanting to return to a packed dormitory, she made her way up there, opening and closing the door behind her. And here she was now, sitting behind the stained glass in the middle of the night, sitting here because she didn't want to be anywhere else. It was peaceful and quiet up there, with no one, not even a ghost, to disturb her. She remembered helping Ron and Harry get Hagrid's dragon off to Ron's brother in their first year from the top of this tower, how great friends they all were. How they had fought the basilisk in their second year and discovered Remus Lupin's secret in their third. How, during their fourth, they had witnessed the Triwizard Championship in which Harry had taken part, how she had felt when Victor has asked her to the ball. Hermione lingered on that memory and the one later, where she had told Ron that if there was a ball next time, he should ask her. And he had. How dizzy she had been with nerves because the feeling of being asked out by Ron dwarfed any feelings she had ever had for Victor Krum. This time, the second ball of the year, Ron was now her boyfriend, but it was doubtful he would ask her to go. An owl fluttered past the window, probably on its way to the owlery. Hermione shuddered. Had it been worth it, pretending to be Mrs. Frobisher, using Polyjuice potion to try to induce expression of his feelings? Somehow, Hermione concluded, it was not. Hermione reached to her neck and felt for the necklace. She still wore it, the beautiful necklace that Cecilia Frobisher had given to her. In fact, sometimes she wore it under her uniform. It was nice to feel close to her sometimes, like being closer to her own mole roots, and now that she had planted the continuum of wizards in Snape's possession, her feelings of anger had waned. We will all look lovely, thought Hermione as the image of the Christmas ball made a reappearance in her mind. By then, the examinations will be over, and so would the orders plan. She buckled her knees up under her folded arms. And she would have caught Ron and Harry in suitably pleasant moods, and she could share with them the continuum. Hermione didn't know why she didn't go straight to bed that night. Perhaps it was because she had been in the habit of walking around the castle for the last 6 weeks at night working on the continuum of wizards. Perhaps it was because she wasn't ready to settle back to a day's revision when she knew that her work could change her friends' lives at any moment. Whatever the reason that Hermione made her way down to the library, it meant that she caught part of a very interesting conversation. A conversation between a returned Professor Umbridge and Professor Penright using the Floo network. A conversation which described, from what Hermione could hear, that a trace had been placed on Cecilia Frobisher when she had left Lupin's cottage. A conversation which implied that her ex-Mole Studies teacher could not be found if she were living amongst moles, but, as soon as she reacquainted herself with the wizard world, they'd have her. A conversation whose information Hermione felt the need to pass on to Professor Snape. 88,888,888. It was dark. Darkness overwhelmed the little room in the Dursley household, and Cecilia Frobisher had woken up from a restless sleep. It was the dreams that were hardest to overcome. At the time of day when everything was supposed to be fluffy clouds and angels, all Cecilia could dream about were the events of the great battle, the attack on the cottage and Remus Lupin. This night was no exception, and her dreams had been filled with her Remus lying in a fetal position in front of the fire. She had tried to call out to her in her dream, she had tried to reach him. He was speaking in her mind, crying out for her, but it was as if she were behind the cottage's windows, looking in from the outside. Her dream had turned to their bedroom, and Remus was asleep. He was asleep and she was next to him. He had called her name. Not her name, her name. And over his body were injuries more than a full moon could induce. It was dark, and Cecilia Frobisher recalled the fading sight of her beloved wizard as he lay, injured by her side. not her side, her side. She, Cecilia, was somewhere outside, looking in through the window. She sat up in the single bed, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles duvet cover that had apparently once belonged to Dudley encasing the only comfort she had. Cecilia was awake and could no more think of sleep than if she had woken up refreshed. He had called her name, so piteously, so desiredly. Not her name, her name. Rivulets of tears streamed over Donatello as Cecilia Frobisher wept over her lot, and weeping mainly for the guilt which began to infuse through her as the reality of how comfortable she had become in the Dursley household and teaching Dudley that Remus had barely featured on her mental landscape. She wanted to be at home with him despite her adaptation to the Dursley household. What she wanted more than anything was to be reassured. What she wanted above anything else was to know that it was all a dream. That the name she had heard her Remus call, which was not her own, was not true. But she knew that he had had feelings for her. Not her, but her. And the burden pressed on her chest so hard she felt she couldn't breathe. Cecilia threw back the covers and, over the top of her decade-old pajamas, she threw on a dressing gown that Mrs. Dursley had lent her. She pulled away the chair that was propping up the handle of the door before unlocking it. Then she picked her way down the stairs quickly and quietly. There was only one person who could reassure her, but that person. Those people. Were gone. Under the hall table sat the telephone directory, and Cecilia leafed quickly to the front for the number of the operator. Once she had found it, she made her way into the living room, closing the door behind her. She picked up the phone and dialed, running through the stark information that she had available to her. It was all she could do, all she had left. Operator, which name please? W. Wells, stammered Cecilia. Wells, repeated the operator. Which location? Scotland, said Cecilia, her breath heavy. Scotland? Can you be more specific? Not really, whispered Cecilia as the creak of a floorboard overhead made her jump. I'll wait. We have over 300 listings for the name Wells, replied the operator. Cecilia's heart beat faster as her mental horizon began to diminish. Thank you, said Cecilia, pulling the phone from her head. She replaced it onto the receiver and stared out through the gap in the net curtains at the block-paved drive. Over 300 Wellses. She wouldn't be speaking to her mother that night. Defeated, Cecilia sat on the sofa waiting for the day to dawn. There was no sleeping now. All she could do was wait. Wait until Mrs. Dursley got up and refused her help with breakfast. Wait until Mr. Dursley got up and avoid his lewd remarks as she changed into clothes. Wait until Dudley Dursley arose and protested about learning science. Wait until Snape knocked at the front door and told her she was going home. The early morning sunlight began to peek in through the window like a nervous peeping Tom. Cecilia leaned her head back on the settee and her eye settled on the pile of newspapers that Vernon Dursley insisted on having delivered but rarely read. Picking one up at random, Cecilia swung her legs up onto the settee, an act which would have, had it been done in front of Petunia Dursley, made her ears ring with silent reprimand, and rested the newspaper on her knees. The Labour Party. Tony Blair. Blair's Babes. Princess Diana on holiday. Northern Ireland. Those were the topics that dominated the first dozen or so pages of the newspaper. She flicked a bit further on to the must-have fashion section of the newspaper before turning to the letters. What I want to know is, will the new Prime Minister do something about immigration? I think not. The words from one of the letters that had been clearly sent in by a regular reader of the newspaper, for they had cited articles from previous issues earlier in their letter, made Cecilia shake her head, and she realized for the first time how foolish moles such as C. Thorny hearts must seem to wizards, so wrapped up in their own little lives. Cecilia turned to the back page and glanced at the sports section. Villa had won their match against Arsenal. Well, at least some things were worth printing. Wimbledon was due to start very soon indeed by the look of a couple of pages' coverage of some American tennis players a few leaves in. She turned to the back again. Something looked odd. She scanned across the page before folding down the paper. Then she looked at it again. Cecilia shook her head. Why did a random page of football scores, the inevitable back page cartoon and a photograph of a newly purchased Stan Collymore taking the third goal of the match against Liverpool make her feel better all of a sudden? She didn't know, but looking at it was helping to soothe her mind. A few moments later, newspaper in hand, Cecilia made her way back upstairs, locking her bedroom door again before climbing back under 4 young malformed fighting amphibians and closing her eyes. 88,888,888. Harry's mind a little more at ease since he had spoken to Ron again. That Sunday morning he and his friend had taken a walk down the school's scree slope towards Hagrid's cottage and discussed things. Ron had told Harry he wasn't going to be spending as much time with Hermione, something that prompted Harry to confide in him a little. Once they established that Hagrid was not to be found that morning, they continued their walk towards the Black Lake, instead of heading back to their common room to continue with their OWL preparations. "You can glimpse into Snape's mind?" said Ron as he listened intently to Harry's undetailed description of the memory slide. "You can find out where Mrs. Frobisher is." "Ugh. I don't ever want to look in there again," replied Harry, shaking his head. "Why? What have you found?" Harry shook his head again before looking back at his friend. Ron was back. Of course he was going to tell him. "Ever since the connection, I keep dreaming about being at the Dursleys. I'm in my bedroom at Privet Drive. Even though I'm asleep I keep waking up. In my dreams," he added explanatorily, "I keep thinking about the wizards in the Order, as I'm lying in bed at the Dursleys. Mundungus Fletcher. Snape. Lupin." Harry trailed off and shook his head. "I don't understand it. It's weird." "Harry, you don't think that you know who's behind it, do you?" He stared at his friend, who shrugged. "I don't know. He might be. I've had this dream every night since the memory slide. I think it must be connected." They continued to walk in silence for a while as they crossed the small unnecessary bridge that linked one loop of the lake to another. "Ron, I spoke to Sirius," Harry continued. "He pretty much told me to not contact him again." "He said that?" Ron's mouth was open in astonishment. "Not in so many words. He told me to get on with it myself, and wait for the potion. He told me I shouldn't involve anyone else." He saw Ron's shoulders sag. "But I couldn't do it without my best friend." Ron beamed. "He also told me that Hermione had contacted him." Harry left the sentence hanging in the air and waited for Ron to reply. Instead of speaking, Ron just shook his head. "What?" asked Harry. "I told her to leave it," said Ron, looking solemnly at his friend, and stopped walking. Harry stopped too. "I told her to get on with being a fifth-year student and study for her OWLs. She's got this idea that she knows enough science to help make your potion." Harry rolled his eyes and shook his head. "I told her she was crazy. She seems to think she was the cause of Mrs. Frobisher's discovery, because she was learning science from her." Ron stopped and began to walk. "Is she?" asked Harry, who realized that Ron had begun to walk. "Anyone could have been," he added. "Sirius told me that. I could have been, or your mum." Ron gave him a look that could have rivaled his mother's. "I'm just saying, anyone who communicated with Mrs. Frobisher at the cottage could have caused the Ministry to find her," he clarified. The glint of murder in his friend's eye disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. "The point is, we don't know, and unless Hermione knows something else, neither does she," Harry concluded as they continued their walk along the path between the Black Lake and the Forbidden Forest, and Ron grinned at him. Harry smiled too. He had enjoyed their morning. It had reminded them of when younger, before Ron and Hermione had realized they had feelings for one another. "So what did you see in Snape's mind?" asked Ron at length. his question laced with interest. Was it gruesome and disgusting? Harry nodded, and proceeded to confide in Ron the memory he had caught of Snape. He did not dwell on the details but described the lustful act that he had witnessed being played in the mind of his potions master. "Maybe your mind's getting stronger," said Ron, once Harry had finished. "Or Snape's is getting weaker. Maybe your attempt to block out you-know-who is paying off." "Sirius said that mysterious cause memory slides," said Harry slowly. "Perhaps it's nothing to do with our minds. Perhaps it's something to do with Penright." "What are you saying, Harry?" asked Ron. Harry shook his head. "I don't know. I do know is that things are very strange when she's around. The lessons are worse than useless, we all know that. But we both know Mrs. Frobisher didn't wake up," confirmed Ron. "So what you saw wasn't a proper memory. Mrs. Frobisher isn't a witch, and they didn't fall for each other when they were younger. It's like I said all along, it's all in the mind." Ron stopped talking and turned to look at the Black Lake. Below the surface he was sure he could see merpeople, swimming in amongst the reeds and foliage. "You were brave enough to take the potion before, so this time you know what to expect." Harry nodded, but he didn't mean it. It was bad enough trying to work out what was going on alone without telling anyone, Sirius was right about that. But his best friend just didn't see. Just didn't understand. But at least they were back to normal. 88,888,888. It was almost halfway through Sunday afternoon and Draco Malfoy was feeling rather pleased with himself. The weekend had been more than fruitful and light was shining at the end of the tunnel. Sitting in the dipped lawn, out of sight of Mr. McFarlane and awaiting the news that Cree and Elric were bringing Avaza and his gang, who were expecting him and Dudley to meet him at the local park. Lying on his stomach, Darren's hair fluttered in the breeze which danced playfully above him, and he smiled again. Dudley's science books. Oh, how glorious his work was now. He could now take them in their entirety to his father, who in turn could give them to the Dark Lord. He shook his head and turned over a page. It was good quality. Much of what the books contained explained plenty of detail about chemical reactions, forces, energy and human biology. Whoever this teacher was, they certainly were teaching Dudley Dursley a thing or two. And not only about science, Dudley had told him, in between telling his friend about his father's untoward behavior towards his tutor, that she had taught him about other topics in which he was struggling, at his mother's behest. The story about a dictator in Germany who had caused the death of millions of moles almost 60 years before had genuinely caught Draco's attention, and he had commented to Dudley that it had sounded dreadful. Very soon though, Dudley would be back and he would be able to tell him all about what he had learned. Draco smiled again as he contemplated what his immediate future would hold. Glory and honor. And being free of this mole-reeking place for good. "What you got, Daz?" Draco looked up sharply and met the eye of Eric. His instinct was to curse the mole boy for speaking to him with such hostility, but he knew that was just his manner. "Duds," replied Darren, leaning back and passing the notebook to him. "You all right, Cree?" The girl nodded and looked at Elric, who was reading the information on the open pages. "Science?" asked Cree, looking at Draco. "I didn't think you were taking any exams." "I'm not," said Draco casually, "but I'm a bit tired of sitting in lessons and knowing nothing. Just thought I'd be prepared." He sat back on his hands casually and waited for his friends to join him, which they did. Elric handed Draco back Dudley's book. "Won't Duds you to be going mad at him for not having it?" asked Cree, sweeping her long, dyed black hair out of her face. "Probably," said Darren. They all grinned. "Well, speaking of being prepared, what are you doing tomorrow, Daz?" "You're off out with Dud, aren't you?" Cree and Elric exchanged glances. Draco grinned inwardly with delight. Clearly neither of them knew of their plans. To London, yeah, replied Elric. Didn't he invite you? Draco nodded. But I'm expecting a phone call from the olds, said Draco casually. But you enjoy yourselves, he added. He noticed Elric and Cree look at one another again. We're going to be back in time for 6, said Cree, smiling at Draco. Aza's expecting to see you and Dud down the park at 6:30. Draco tensed. He hadn't wanted to face the huge teenager again, and he knew that, if he had got away with a couple of curses last time, now, being so much closer to his goal, he wanted to do nothing that would jeopardize that. Great, he said as he took back Dudley's book from Elric. Dud. All three reprobates looked past the book and at their fourth friend whose book had caused so much discussion and grinned. Dudley grinned back. How's home? Asked Elric darkly. And your work? Boring, said Dudley, stepping down into the dip and sitting down next to his friends. Science. Physics. Yawn yawn yawn. I'd hate it, said Elric, shuddering. Cree and Darren nodded in agreement. Here you are, said Draco, handing Dudley the book back. Most enlightening. He watched his friend's face turn to thunder. You had it? Shouted Dudley, flicking over a few pages. Draco grinned evilly. Bet your tutor was mad, Elric said, grinning too. Cree let out a shriek of gleeful delight. Dudley snorted, grinning too. She was, he replied, laughing heartily. Soon the other three were laughing along with him. So, said Dudley at length. Dad's coming tomorrow to pick us up. Shame you can't make it, Daz, he added, looking sympathetically. Where are we going again? Elric frowned, hoping his friend's answer would change from what he had given the day before. Natural History Museum, said Dudley, leaning back on the crisp clean grass and throwing his notebook under his head. It's supposed to be fun. Mum chose it and she's insisting we take the tutor. He looked across at Darren. It'll be a celebration, at any rate, he added, closing his eyes. What for? Well, my cousin'll be home from school soon and I suppose my tutor will have gone by then. You're celebrating your cousin coming home? Asked Cree. Hate him, said Dudley firmly, opening his eyes a little. Right little martyr, he is. I see it as a celebration of the fact that he's been away for 9 months. And my exams'll be over soon. He glanced at Darren. Don't worry Daz, you won't miss much. 88,888,888. Good evening. Minerva McGonagall stood before the Order of the Phoenix and surveyed the witches and wizards woefully. She was too old for this, she thought as she watched faces turn expectantly to her, waiting trusting in her. Well, of course Albus was much older than her but he had the experience. It was his order. Good evening all, she continued, glancing around the wizards who had all come, who had all become entirely familiar with the plan that was to involve them also very soon. The plan had come to its culmination, revealed fully to each and every one of the Order by Dumbledore 2 days ago before leaving Grimmauld Place hastily soon afterwards. All bar one. Remus Lupin was the only absent wizard. That had been bad enough. What was worse was that, except for a brief visit very early on Saturday morning, Albus Dumbledore had left again and she didn't know where he was. Minerva hoped this situation would be temporary. She didn't think that she could continue to be so calm for much longer, especially when nearly every wizard before her had asked her where he was. We have some information that is pertinent to the plan that Albus put in place in Friday. He has confided in me to reveal to you that, not only is Harry aware of the prophecy, he is also still fully prepared for his role. I know that many of you were concerned about this. She looked around, watching some of the wizards nodding to one another. And now to our agenda, which was suspended following Friday's change in events. She looked at the Weasley twins who were standing by their father. "I believe, Arthur, you have something to contribute?" Arthur Weasley looked up from his notes that he was making for the meeting, looking somewhat flustered. Beside him his sons were beaming widely, waiting for their father to speak. Next to them stood Mrs. Weasley, staring at her husband. "Yes, yes. My sons, everyone. My sons." Everyone looked at Mr. Weasley, waiting to hear what Fred and George had done. "You don't have to speak for us, Father," said Fred, grinning at George. "No, we can tell everyone about what we've done for Mrs. Frobisher." At her son's words, Molly Weasley's eyes narrowed and Mr. Weasley rolled his eyes. "Every newspaper every day for a year," said Fred. "Mrs. Frobisher's own illustrations. To keep up morale." "And what does that mean?" asked an accusative Mrs. Weasley. Arthur Weasley looked at her guiltily. "Never mind, Molly, I'll tell you later." "Well, thank you Fred, George," said Minerva McGonagall, "for your totally enlightening explanation. Now," she continued, happy to move on quickly, "so we need to discuss the time scale in which we must act. We know that Voldemort is likely to attack the Ministry." "What time do we have, Minerva?" asked Sturgis, a worried expression on his face. "Very little. Snape is very close to Harry's potion and we have kept Ministry involvement to a minimum." "Any chance of Cecilia coming back from wherever she is?" asked Tonks, who had noticed the absence of Remus Lupin. "She is not safe, from neither the Ministry nor the enemy. Rest assured she is somewhere where she can continue the work she has volunteered to do as well as keep the rest of the information safe." Dumbledore's words, thought Minerva. It had calmed the Order well enough, by the nodding and smiling in front of her, but that didn't mean it would work for long. Sooner or later he, or perhaps she, must come up with something firm. "Don't forget," Minerva continued, "the Ministry still seeks the Universal Link, and although Miss Penright is working through the information she has been allowed access to," here she raised her eyebrows at Sturgis, "she has a long way to go and plenty of red herrings to uncover." "So you have her under close watch?" asked Sirius Black, his voice low and clear. "I have, as does Dolores Umbridge. Her interference at Hogwarts has been orchestrated entirely by Dumbledore. He believes in creating situations where people believe they have done the thinking for themselves." The Order began to talk at low volume to the people around them. Minerva exhaled. It was a good sign and the buzz around the room felt positive. She spotted a hand raised like a lone tree on a moor. "Yes, Bathsheba? The Ministry is getting very strict, Minerva. I don't like these melon squib legislations they have brought in. What happened to their stance before? They have to blame it on someone, so it might as well be muggles," said Sturgis Podmore, darkly. "It rains in the summer, it smells. Someone stubs their toe, it smells. Just now, the difference is that the Ministry had to explain away a large event which they can't admit was VV. You know who, so it might as well be muggles who launched their power-hungry return outside Hogwarts Castle on Saturday 24th February. It's exactly what the Death Eaters and You know who want, getting the law changed and the Ministry involved to their own ends. Makes what they're saying more legitimate." Minerva nodded. She couldn't have put it better herself. "Thank you, Sturgis. I echo this. It is true to say extremists begin in government, Joseph Black, for example." She heard a grunt coming from the vicinity of Sirius. "My family getting the blame again," he muttered, folding his arms as he got to his feet. Minerva watched him go as the rest of the meeting fell into disarray. The whole room became glum because there was no clear goal. No success that had been achieved. Even Molly Weasley's sandwiches were tired and drab. As the witches and wizards of the Order left Grimmauld Place in dribs and drabs half an hour later, one happy thought crossed the McGonagall's mind. Dumbledore would never ask her to chair a meeting again. 88,888,888. Minerva McGonagall was actually wrong in her assertion that all but one wizard from the Order, excluding Dumbledore, was absent from the Order meeting. Severus Snape was also absent and pursuing work that would, he believed, would verify the efficacy of Harry Potter's potion once and for all. He was not at Hogwarts, nor was he anywhere in the vicinity of Surrey, more specifically, Little Whinging. Indeed, he was as far west of Cumbria as he could get without taking a swim in the Irish Sea, though that had only been down to luck. Half an hour ago and the brilliant lights at Calder Hall Power Station at Sellafield shone out around him, and Snape had used the spell Hominum Revelio to discern the presence of moles around the place. He had done quite well, having located the bioanalytical department within one of the buildings and had only had to obliterate 7 moles in the process. Nick Smith had not been expecting his visit, but he had to give the mole credit for his recognition of him. He had met him almost a year before, when he had dropped off some glassware and equipment at Cecilia Frobisher's house. Clearly Tonks, in her state of disorientation, she had failed to bring even one of the traces with her 2 nights before and could not recall what her husband had said about them, had forgotten to mention his arrival.